Folks, Tracy, thank you so much for that, humbled by that introduction. And I got to make sure that I pay my publicist this month. It's so great to get a chance to be with y'all tonight. And I know, the artificiality of Zoom and being remote, and believe me, I'd rather be up north with y'all because it was in the mid 90s down here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we'll go ahead and get that set up. So what we're going to talk about, and really do want to make it as much of a conversation as opposed to the Charlie Brown want teacher, is want this to be a safe space to be able to ask questions and not worry about, am I using the right words? Am I going to ask something that is going to be offensive? As Tracy alluded to, Navy nurse, lawyer, I'm as crusty as can be, and I'm an attorney, so I have no soul anyway. You can't offend me. And June 1st, happy Pride. So one of the other things that I've gotten a chance to do is for the very first time in the history of the Navy, where we've named a ship after an openly gay person, Harvey Milk, the LGBTQ civil rights leader. Now, it's not the first ship in the history of the Navy that's been named after a gay or lesbian person. There have been others, but the Navy just didn't know about it. And the Secretary of the Navy asked me to be the co-sponsor along with Dianne Feinstein. And last November, I had the privilege of breaking the champagne bottle on the ship out in San Diego and getting champagne all over myself and the Secretary of the Navy. Now, as a good lawyer, I got to have some disclaimers. So the pictures that are in there, I don't own the copyrights. They're there for educational purposes. Fair use, fair use, fair use. The other caveat is we're going to be talking about some sensitive things, and I would be negligent if I didn't talk about certain areas. And you may not like what I have to say, depending on your perspective, where you come from, who you are. You may like it, you may not like it, but you can't blame Johns Hopkins Medicine. You can't blame the United States Navy. You can say Paul is a schmuck, and you can blame me. Now, a couple of personal disclaimers that I'll give you is I'm a Christian. I was baptized into the Roman Catholic faith. I went to Regis High School on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and I was taught by the Jesuits. Regis is the #1 Catholic high school in the country. I left the Catholic Church over a trans issue, but it wasn't the fact that I'm transgender. It was transubstantiation of all things. And that's a picture of Ronald Reagan handing me my diploma the day that I graduated from the Naval Academy on May 22nd, 1985, which of all things would have been Harvey Milk's 55th birthday had he lived. And it's really odd that I can go look on YouTube and I can find the clip, because that's where I got that picture from. And that disclaimer there is, I was a Republican. I voted for, first person I voted for was Ronald Reagan. So as we're talking about politics and the impact that it has on the transgender community, on the LGBTQ plus community broadly, is I've been a Democrat, I've been a Republican, I've been an independent. So it really isn't a matter of, an agenda. Is I'm going to say some things that are going to come across as potentially being highly partisan, but it's more of, this is an objective reality because we're dealing with a broken system. So that's the background of moi. So what are we going to talk about? Well, we'll start off with talking about what does it mean when you hear this word cis heteronormativism? What is that? How does it shape the conversation? And then, when we talk about transgender and gender diverse people, who are we talking about? Who are they? What's some of the language? What are some of the basic definitions? And then what are some of the issues that the community is facing? Now, I work in healthcare, and, coming at it from a healthcare perspective with the understanding that every aspect of life impacts our health. And then when we talk about medical care, when we talk about gender affirming care, you hear this term is, what does it mean? And then what does it specifically mean for kids? Because that is absolutely something that, you pick up the newspaper, you look at your media feed, you turn on the TV, and you hear a consistent drumbeat these days of different states taking different actions. Well, what does it really mean? What are the facts? What is the evidence? And we'll talk about some of that stuff. And then lastly, the $64,000 question is, what can I do? What can I as an individual in this big, complex situation, what is it that I can do to maybe make a difference? And then anything you want, this, I always look at this as the opportunity. This is your time to ask and learn and share your perspective with me, because I always find that I get as much out of this, if not more, than I think that I put into it. So that's kind of the roadmap. And then, as Tracy was mentioning, as we go along, folks have questions or a comment, please feel free to unmute and share. I'm going to get to the bottom line up front. Treating all of God's children with dignity and respect is a non-debatable subject. You don't get to use any justification like your religiosity, your social conservatism, liberalism, whichever side you're on, to justify degrading someone else's humanity, to deny someone else the autonomy of their own existence. That's not up for, well, I think it should be like this. And the bottom line is, don't be a jerk. This is Sermon on the Mount, golden rule stuff. We talk about, I want to treat other people the way that I want to be treated. And if we think, when we talk in terms of, transgender folks, is you want to be called your name. You don't want to be misgendered. You want the reality of your existence to be acknowledged and not subject to debate. Neither does anybody else. You don't want to make assumptions about people, particularly based on how they look and how they sound. I sound like a brassy old broad from New Jersey because I'm old enough to use the word broad to describe myself. And as Tracy mentioned, I really am from Jersey City. If you couldn't see me and all you were hearing was my voice, your unconscious bias, and I say you as the general you, not so much about any one of you individually, hear the timbre, the pitch, the tone of my voice, and put that in that male category, and then reflexively call me sir. Now, I know that happens because it happens all the time on the telephone when I'm talking to customer service representatives, because we've been teed up to make an assumption that if you sound this way, you must be a guy. You sound this way, you must be a girl. You look this way, oh, you might be gay. Or you look this way, you might be a lesbian. You look this way, you might be a male. You look this way, you might be female. And we'll talk about some ways to how we can interact with each other to kind of get right past those assumptions, to get to knowing somebody or giving them the opportunity to share so that you can avoid some of this stuff. And you are going to screw it up. You are going to misgender somebody. You're going to ask somebody a question in a really clumsy way because you're a human being and we are flawed and we make mistakes. Now, I work in this space way more than probably, I'm willing to bet Tracy's paycheck that anybody else on this call that I work in this space more often. And I make mistakes. I'm sure that I have a non-binary colleague, and I'll talk more about what all the terms mean. They use they as their pronoun. And I've been in conversations with them and I have used the wrong pronoun, and I'm well aware of what pronoun they use. I get it right 85% of the time, but I still trip up, and I trip up because of my own unconscious bias and all of the stuff that I've learned that I have to get past. So it doesn't matter really so much that you're going to make a mistake. It's what you do when you make the mistake and it's brought to your attention. Don't get defensive. Take the correction with some grace, because you might catch yourself or someone else is going to catch it for you. It's not the, oh, this is really tough for me. Oh, this is new. So it is not new. It is not really, really tough to ask somebody what their name is and then use it. To ask somebody what their pronoun is and then use it. To let somebody be. And when you give that apology, make it an authentic one. Not the Washington apology. I'm sorry that you were offended. Because how that translates as, I didn't do anything wrong, and you're an overly sensitive snowflake and you need to suck it up and grow some thick skin, because I'm not changing. I didn't do anything wrong. It's like, hey, I'm sorry. I wasn't as thoughtful as I should be. And then pay attention and don't make the same mistake twice. Because if you make the same mistake twice, it just means you weren't paying attention the first time. You weren't listening. Any comments, perspective regarding any of that? So let's talk about what cis heteronormativity is. All right. First off, using reaction, somebody, give me a thumbs up if you've even heard that term before, or is this a, brand new word? Yeah, I'm seeing some thumbs up. I'm, seeing some not. So when we look at our society, when we look at our culture, and I'm going to speak in very US centered terms. We're beginning to recognize and begin to reckon with the structural racism that has been built into our society here in North America. That the game has been rigged in terms of race from the start. Well, it's also been rigged in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. Cis heteronormatism is that belief that basically is the assumption that everybody is straight. They're heterosexual. And that their gender identity exists within a binary, which is a binary, male or female, and that your gender is based solely on the genitalia that somebody took a quick glance at when you were born, and that is determinative for the rest of your life. And that's just the way things have always been. Until recently. Now, obviously, gay folks, and I'm using gay as an umbrella term for a second, I'll define it in a little bit. have always been part of humanity. People that today we would use the word transgender to describe have always been part of humanity. You know, these aren't new concepts. But society was designed by intent and neglect to not recognize and include those folks. So when we talk about some of the terms, some of the background, the one perspective that almost all of us were exposed to, if not indoctrinated with, from the time we were little kids, is a very binary view of the world. So talking about some basic terms. So let's talk about sexual orientation first. Sexual orientation is the attraction that one human being feels towards other people. And then, you know, we think of it mostly in terms of physical attraction, sexual attraction, romantic attraction. You know, but it's really all the dimensions that people are attracted to each other. And then, depending on how the person identifies and how the individual or individuals that they're attracted to identify, then that sets what other language we use. If I'm a man and I'm attracted to a woman, or I'm a woman and I'm attracted to a man, that means straight and heterosexual. Now, that's the majority of the people on the planet. Depending, you can go look at, you know, percentages of population, somewhere around 90%, you know, plus or minus a percentage or two, are straight. When we hear terms like gay, right? Gay can be used as an umbrella term for any community that's based on the idea of sexual orientation other than heterosexual and straight. Some people like that it's an umbrella term, other people don't. Specifically, it's a term to relate to someone who identifies as a man, male, who's attracted to other men. Lesbian would be the word for women who are attracted to women within that binary, and I'll get back to talking about what the binary is. Bisexual, you know, is someone who's attracted to both men and women within that binary. And it doesn't mean that they're confused or they're greedy or that, you know, they, you know, have no sense of themselves. Quite the opposite. They're just attracted to men and women. Now you may hear a term pansexual, which goes beyond the binary. And that's an individual who's attracted to other human beings. And the other person's gender identity really isn't a salient point. They're attracted to the person.
Mm-hmm.
You may hear people identify as asexual. Now, being asexual and you know, celibate are not the same thing.
Mm.
Celibacy refers to you have the attraction, but you don't act on it. Whereas someone who may identify as asexual doesn't feel that attraction. And notice that the term is sexual orientation. It's not sexual preference. Now, again, a lot of us have heard that term used. We've been kind of teed up to describe sexual orientation as sexual preference. Because when we talk about things like gay lifestyle or transgender lifestyle or sexual preference, words like lifestyle and preference have been used because it implies that your sexual orientation is a choice. And that we're not bigots and bad people if there's a negative consequence of your bad choice. When we actually talk about a sexual preference is I like blondes as opposed to brunettes. I like being on top as opposed to being on the bottom. That's a sexual preference. Questions, comments? Everybody cool, tracking, happy, joy so far? Okay.
Hi, Paula. I'll speak up because I know what it feels like to be the one person talking. I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but I think in general we're probably cool with what you're saying. I don't think you're going to get a lot of resistance from this crowd.
Yeah, I looked at you folks online in my preparation for stuff. So yeah, I don't think that there's probably going to be a lot of pushback and or a lot of, oh hey, not open to the language. So that I think is really great. It's when we're talking about now gender identity, gender identity is that deep-rooted sense of yourself in a gendered way. Now, the two big kind of overarching terms that you may hear is cisgender. And same deal, bet Tracy's paycheck. The majority of the people on this call are cisgender. And that just means that your gender identity, your sense of yourself in that gendered way, is aligned with the sex you were assigned at birth. Now, gender and sex are not the same thing. English is a sloppy language. That's why we lawyers get rich. I must have slept through that class in law school. When we talk about sex, in the scientific portion of this, you may be talking about chromosomes and hormone exposure and the interaction between chromosomes and genetics and hormone exposure and primary and secondary sexual characteristics. The sex assigned at birth, for most of us, and even until today, and the world is changing on this, again, overall majority of people either got an M or an F. And as much science as went into that designation is, you popped out, whoever delivered you took a quick look, and I always say that I'm a nurse, I have to use technical terms, a winky or a hoo-hoo, and said, you have a lovely baby boy, you have a lovely baby girl. In my case, when I was born back in 1963, the dark ages, black and white TV, doc handed me to my mom and said, Mrs. Neira, you have a lovely baby boy. My mom didn't know any better. I didn't know any better at the time, and neither did the doc. Transgender folks are folks whose gender identity doesn't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. That their gender identity is something different. And then again, the words that people use to describe themselves in this term vary. Man, male, female, woman, transgender man, transgender woman, trans woman, non-binary. Someone who identifies as non-binary doesn't see themselves as exclusively male or female. Western culture, Western Europe, North America, the places where the Europeans colonized, have a very binary view of gender. It's two boxes, you got to be in one box. And the box we originally put you in is the only one you can stay in. Indigenous cultures across the globe have viewed gender as a spectrum. And more people in our society are identifying as non-binary. The latest study shows there's about 1 million people in the United States who identify as non-binary. About 2% of high school students identify as transgender. So as our society evolves, we're seeing a different perspective. And the terms that people use to identify a non-binary gender identity may be non-binary or NB, which is just an N and a B. You may hear terms like genderqueer. there are actually about 72 different terms that people will use as descriptors to describe their gender identity. And you always want to give people the opportunity to use their own language and use their own descriptors as opposed to us putting a label on them. You may hear folks that are gender fluid. And the way that I describe this is that, so if you see gender as a spectrum, and again, most people are at those poles of male and female. Folks who may not see themselves as associated as one or the other, maybe somewhere along that spectrum. Someone who's gender fluid oscillates a little bit more on that spectrum. So given a context, an environment, a situation, that gendered sense of self may vary a little bit. Now, you may hear people use the word queer to describe either their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And if somebody uses that word, my reaction when I hear that is, I ask them, what does that mean to them? Because the word queer, in some ways, is a loaded word. Older folks grew up at a time when that was a slur. Younger folks are taking back that word and using it to describe themselves, being empowered to use that word in a different way. And for trying to get folks to understand how that works, how many people know that the term Yankee Doodle is actually a slur? Yeah. For the folks who hadn't heard that, is that yes, Yankee Doodle was a slur made up about the American colonists by the British. And, we took ownership of the word, wrote a silly song, and that's why to this day around the world, Americans are known as the Yankees and the Yanks, because we took that word back and gave it a different meaning. And kids today are doing the same thing with the word queer. Now, some other terms that play into this are things like gender expression. That's how we express our gender. And again, that is defined by culture. In one culture, something may be determined as feminine, and in another culture, it may be more masculine. We think about in gender stereotypes, the whole notion of girls wear pink and boys wear blue. Anybody want to take a guess at how old that concept is? Somebody type in the chat, a number that you think how old that is. Okay, so somebody suggested 1940, so 75 years. Victorian England. So it's like maybe now starting to push maybe a century and a half. And what color was associated with boys when all of this fun started? Pink. So it wasn't like when Julius Caesar popped out of his mom that they wrapped him in a blue blanket. This wasn't back in the day. This is a recent societal construct. That's why these gender reveal parties are always so much fun. As it was in the elevator with one of my colleagues, pregnant. They were again talking about the child, and the gender reveal, and talking about, oh, it's a girl and pink and all that kind of stuff. And I says, well, hopefully you're going to have a healthy child, and maybe somewhere between 6 and 18 years after they're born, you're going to find out whether or not you got a boy or a girl. Once they're old enough to be able to tell you what their gender identity is. When we talk in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation, is we grow to learn who we are. So yes, there are transgender kids. Kids come out at an earlier age today because our society, even though it's got lots and lots of problems, is much more progressive, much more accepting than it was 50 years ago, when I was getting to the point where I realized that, hey, something's different about me. Early 1970s, absolutely no vocabulary Didn't know any of the words that I just threw out. And there was no place to go look. You know, you couldn't go to the local school, the library, and ask the librarian, hey, this is what I'm feeling. You got a book about that? By the time I was 11, I realized that it was gender, that I was a girl. And it wasn't because I liked the color pink or playing with Barbie dolls or wearing dresses. That kind of stuff might have been fun. But I was also an all-star baseball and soccer player, played with GI Joes, played street hockey. There was nothing effeminate about me. And when I had the conversation with my mom freaked out. And in that moment of watching my mom's reaction, when I said, I think I'm a girl, I learned a whole lot of lessons. That this is bad, this is shameful. You do not want to be one of those people. And I didn't even know who those people were still. Don't have this conversation again with mom. Don't say anything to dad. This is bad. This is not acceptable. That's that immediate lesson from watching my mom's reaction. Okay. So mom's reaction and the lesson that I learned in that moment is an example of unconscious bias and how it plays in for all of us. And again, how it builds in and just flows out of that cis heteronormative society that that we're in. Unconscious bias is normal. It's not, oh, you're a bad person because you're biased. If you're a human being, you have unconscious bias. It's been bred into us as a species as a defense mechanism because your brain can't process all of the input it's getting in a thoughtful, conscious way. It's the, it's the script that runs in the back of the operating system. And it's a product of your culture, society, your identity, your experience in training and education. And it's influenced by social media, popular culture, movies, music, by the law, by government action and policy, by your family, by your faith group, and by your peers. All of that goes in to set you up for how you react without thinking about it when you meet somebody new or when you find yourself in a new situation. You ever been walking down the street or in the grocery store and you walk past somebody that looks androgynous, doesn't look, their gender expression isn't immediately, your brain isn't telling you that's immediately masculine or feminine. And what's the question you ask yourself? Was that a boy or a girl? Well, it's because unconsciously, if you can put that person into one of those two boxes, you have scripts in your head already that you're, that the world around you has put there, that I know how to interact with that person if I know that it's a woman, or I know how to interact with that person if I know it's a man. And then when you can't put somebody into that box, you get anxious. Like, what do I do? What do I do? Because we've been teed up that way. I'm a bit, I'm a sci-fi nerd. So yeah, so I'm gonna give you some Yoda quotes. Yeah, one of the first things we have to do, we got to unlearn what we've learned, because we've got to look at things differently, because the world is way more complex than that background that most of us have grown up with. So these are some examples that I pulled, again, within my lane of healthcare. And do you see what the immediate problems are with these forms? And the family history comes out of one of our electronic medical record systems. Does everybody's family include a mother, a father, and sisters and brothers? What happens if the family's got two moms, two dads? What happens if the family, one of the parents is non-binary? What do you do if you have a non-binary sibling? What box do they go in? Because when these systems were designed, family didn't include same-sex couples. Family didn't include non-binary folks. Same thing on the forms. Sex is male and female, binary. That's it, two. This is the society that we're existing in. And one of the reasons, on the other slide, I have a picture of Dory the fish. Because, the comment is that the fish isn't aware of the water around it, because that's just the world that surrounds the fish. For us, until the last 5 to 10 years, we've been living in the fishbowl where everybody's assumed to be straight. Everybody's assumed to be cisgender. And we know that the world isn't that simple. So understanding, folks. Okay. Talked about the different things. The gender unicorn is, this is a reference, some people may have been familiar with. But it really gets to getting people to kind of take a look and see, what their understanding of things are. So when you see the acronyms, okay, the acronym that I use, and it's in my job title, we use it at Hopkins, is LGBTQ+. There are other versions of this acronym that include other letters. Originally, this started out as GLB, gay, lesbian, bisexual. Then added the T. So it was GLBT. Then it got manipulated around to LGBT. Then we added the Q. You may see it written as LGBTQI to include intersex. A and P, there's another Q for questioning. That plus is to recognize that there are other communities, because if you just leave them out, that's that invisibility, that's that, ignoring their issues, their existence. But you also can't have an acronym that's as long as the alphabet either. So it's a little bit of pragmatism. Within research, the phrase that you'll see is SGM, sexual and gender minority. And then TGD is another acronym to talk about transgender and gender-diverse. And I've already talked about some of the different identifiers that people will use to identify either their gender identity or sexual orientation. One thing that I'll say about two-spirit is an indigenous term. And I personally am a little bit of a purist, is that if you're not from an indigenous, background, if that's not you, you'd probably want to be careful about using that term, because it has cultural meanings beyond just gender identity. Other terms that you hear people talk about in terms of gender identity, coming out. I've come out to all of you folks in the course of me, yakking with you. I've shared information about myself, and I'm at the point in my life where if you go look me up online, you're going to find information about me. So me trying to hide, me trying to live in stealth, me trying to, not share that information isn't going to work. Being in the closet is hiding that information about one's sexual orientation and gender identity. And, understand that in talking to me tonight, you're hearing from a highly privileged individual. And you're getting a perspective of an N of one. I do not hold myself out as the spokesperson or the representative person for the LGBTQ plus community, because I'm not. As we look at pride, we talk about pride. One of the questions I always ask people when we want to celebrate is, are you celebrating your sexual orientation or your gender identity? I'm proud I'm a lesbian. I'm proud that I'm gay. I'm proud that I'm trans. Because if that's what you're celebrating, you can't get upset when somebody says, I want to celebrate that I'm straight, or I want to celebrate that I'm cisgender. Because they, straight and cisgender people should be able to celebrate their sexual orientation or gender identity too, if that's all you're celebrating. What I aver is that what we're actually celebrating, what we're actually proud about, is that we have had the courage to live authentically, to live aligned with our values. That's what we're proud about. And, you know, when you think about where people think that, like I said, sexual orientation or gender identity is a choice. If you identify as straight and cisgender, and I don't really expect anybody to answer me, tell me what month and year in your life you made a conscious decision to be straight and cisgender. I mean a conscious decision that I could be trans, I could be cis, I'm going to be cis. I could be straight or I could be gay, using gay as an umbrella term for not straight. And I'm going to choose this. And the answer I know is you didn't, because nobody does. Instead, you come to that understanding of yourself at your own speed. For most of us, our gender identity, we come to it as when we're school-age kids. Some people get to it a little bit later. Sexual orientation, same thing. Maybe around puberty, maybe a little bit later. Some people a little bit later in life. The other thing in all of this is to understand that there is a difference between knowing who you are, accepting who you are, and living as who you are. I knew as a teenager that I was a girl. I didn't accept that until I was 28. And accepting who I was and deciding I'm going to live as my authentic self cost me my career in the Navy. Now, I didn't get thrown out. The Navy didn't know why I left until 10 years after I left, when we did the paperwork, when we made the request to update my discharge documents to put my correct name on them. But that decision to live authentically, that's what other people say, well, that was your choice. It wasn't a choice. I made a decision to live authentically. I decided I wasn't going to live in the closet. I was not going to hide who I was just to make other people comfortable, to meet other people's expectations of who I was supposed to be, who God made me to be, for those of us that are people of faith. That process of going from living aligned with sex assigned at birth to living aligned with your gender identity is transition. That's a word that you'll hear people use. It's unique. It's individualized. Everybody's experience is different. It involves different dimensions. There's a legal dimension, updating your birth certificate, updating your driver's license to reflect your name and your gender marker. There's a social transition, how we look, how we sound, how we interact with each other. Anybody want to argue with me that we don't interact with each other in very gendered ways in our society? Letting your hair grow, piercing your ears, wearing makeup. All of the things that we ascribe as more masculine, more feminine. And then medical, and I'll talk more about medical, you know. What might be medically necessary for one person to, you know, address their medical needs is going to be different. Now, you may hear the term gender nonconforming. So here's some pictures of some gender nonconforming people. That is the first class of women at the Naval Academy, the Coast Guard Academy, and West Point, the class of 1980. In 1980, and actually 1976, when the first women went to the military academies, the Merchant Marine Academy, they actually admitted women before the other service academies, just for a historical footnote. That's gender nonconforming, folks, because in 1976, women were not warriors. They didn't go to West Point and Annapolis and the Coast Guard Academy. Simply, gender nonconforming means not conforming to the gender stereotypes of your society. Now, the two pictures above Peppermint Patty, that's the same person. That is Mary Walker. She is the only woman who was awarded the Medal of Honor. She was a Civil War surgeon. Now, I'm not one of the folks that ascribes modern day terms of identity to historical figures unless they use the term themselves. So there's nothing in the writings that I'm aware of about Mary Walker where she talked about her gender identity, whether or not she felt either as, that she identified as non-binary or as a man. She absolutely defied the gender expressions of her time. She was arrested a couple of times after the Civil War for wearing trousers, because that wasn't what women did in her time. And then I always include Peppermint Patty. Charles Schulz, when he drew that character in the 1960s, was not making a radical statement about gender identity. I know that today, many people in the non-binary community, embrace Peppermint Patty. And if you're a fan of Peanuts, you know that, Peppermint Patty is constantly telling Marcy not to call her sir. But Peppermint Patty is a gender non-conforming kid. Not wearing a dress, playing shortstop. Yeah. That's what that term means. And it tells you absolutely nothing about an individual's sexual orientation or their gender identity. And the other thing about sexual orientation, knowing what someone's sexual orientation, how they may describe themselves, does not tell you anything about their sexual behavior. There are many men who have sex with men who do not identify as gay, particularly in the Black community, because of the other cultural stigma that comes with identifying as gay. Language always evolves. The language we're talking about tonight is different than the language we would have been using 10 years ago. I've actually gone back and I've looked at some things that I wrote 20 years ago. Training that I did in trying to get people to understand transgender folks in the military. And I read it and it's like, ooh, I said it that way? Because today, that language I wouldn't use, but it was the language that was being used 10 years ago. 5 years from now, some of the language we're using tonight may be different. And some of these we've already touched on. I said transgender is an adjective. It's not a noun. Gay can be used as a noun. Gays in the military is an example. You can't say transgenders in the military or transgenders out in the congregations. Transgender people, transgender colleagues, transgender sailors. It's not a verb. Nobody's transgendering. So there's nobody that's transgendered. There's no ED at the end. Don't use terms like sex change. First off, it's not even scientifically accurate, but it's offensive. Today, you're going to hear people talk about transition. When we talk about the medical care, we talk about gender affirming or gender confirming surgery or treatment. And even gender reassignment surgery, you will see, and that was the language of about 10, 15 years ago. We're not reassigning anything. All we're doing is affirming something that already exists in the individual. So that's why that language has evolved. Hermaphrodite, you can use that word to describe a worm. Don't use it to describe a person. Today, the term is intersex. Now, some people put the intersex community within the broader transgender umbrella. Some people see it as a separate community. Intersex folks, you may hear terms like, have differences of sexual development. They're individuals that may have the anatomical structures and organs that aren't, more aligned in that traditional notion of male and female. Transvestite, the modern word is crossdresser. Transsexualism or transgenderism, there is no non-offensive equivalent of that. Those are highly technical terms that today are only used by people that want to deny equality to transgender and gender diverse people, because it's trying to reduce the individual to a medical condition. And historically, we view being transgender as a psychopathology, and that's also not grounded in science anymore. That's not correct. And we already talked about sexual preference and lifestyle. Happy, happy, joy, joy. Now, one of the things is I definitely date myself with some of these pop culture references. Mr. Peabody and Sherman is definitely not something that I would expect, the average 18-year-old today to even recognize. But I've got this picture in here, and my comment of we don't need a Wayback Machine is because we don't need to go back into history to talk about how bad things are for transgender folks in our society and the attacks that they're on, suffering from. 2022, today, this year, there have been over 300 bills introduced across at least, more than half of the United States, targeting gay and transgender folks. 140 of them specifically target transgender youth, either trying to deny or, in Alabama's case, criminalize providing medically necessary care, bar access to the bathroom or the locker room at school that's aligned with their gender identity, or ban them from being able to participate in sports aligned with their gender identity. And that last one is understand that's really targeting transgender girls and young women. And it's the kids that are being attacked. And this, these attempts at legislation are impacting health. In the Trevor Project this year, a study that they just recently did, is that for gay and trans kids, almost half have been suicidal, have thought about killing themselves in the last year because of the environment they're in. 3 out of 4 of them report being harassed and discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Less than 1/3 of them live in a home where their family affirms their gender. And 60% of them couldn't access mental health care even though they need it. Those numbers would be there even if there was no pandemic, because those numbers mirror numbers that existed before the pandemic happened. So, if you were disowned by your family, 40% of homeless youth are queer, you get thrown out of your faith group. 2 largest Christian denominations in the United States are the Southern Baptist Convention and the Roman Catholic Church, both of which are homophobic and transphobic as institutions. And I make a distinction between the institution and the people. They get bullied in school, denied the ability to use the bathroom, denied a job, or fired because of your gender identity. And I put a little asterisk about it because it's only within the last 18 months that our Supreme Court said that our civil rights laws, Title VII, the employment aspect of civil rights, even applies. And it applies because it's a form of sex discrimination. The Equality Act, a bill which would modify Title VII and Title IX to explicitly address discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, passed in the House, and it is absolutely stalled in the Senate. Understand that versions of that bill have been introduced since the 1970s and have never been enacted. Can be denied entry into a homeless shelter, denied medical care, denied insurance. It wasn't until the Affordable Care Act that most transgender people could get health insurance, because being transgender was considered by insurance companies as a pre-existing condition. Again, up until very recently, the previous administration, their position was that our civil rights laws did not apply to the LGBTQ community. In 2016, the regulations changed to allow transgender folks to serve in the military and receive medically necessary care. With the change in administration, there was an attempt by the Trump administration to immediately reimpose a ban on transgender service. When the Biden administration came into office, they threw that out and basically reset it to 2016. But there's nothing in the law to allow that. There's nothing in the law that allows gay people to serve in the military. They're just Department of Defense regulations. 2024 should there be another change in the executive branch, they could immediately try to reimpose those bans, and it'll wind up in court, but they could do it. The lifetime probability for a transgender person to be physically or sexually assaulted is 1 out of 2. Now, I'm talking to you tonight as a transgender woman who has never been assaulted. And I always say that the person who decides they want to try to assault me is in for a world of surprise. I'm a Naval Academy grad. I'm a combat veteran. I served in Desert Storm. Understand that that is pure bravado. I know transgender women who were in special forces. They were SEALs, they were Rangers, they were Green Berets, and they've had their ass kicked for being a transgender woman. They're much bigger badass warriors than I ever was. And I'm a fat old broad now. I'm broken down and old. You know, I might get them 2 out of 3 falls, and I might put in a licking before I lost. But yeah, that's the world that most transgender people exist in. So it's no surprise that you might self-medicate with alcohol or drugs or food, that you might be anxious or depressed, that you might think about suicide, or that you become the victim of violence or trauma. Healthy People 2020, this was created back in 2010. The first time the federal government ever thought about dealing with LGBTQ health issues. When we talk about the social determinants of health, you know, health is not just being not sick or not injured. It's that collective ability to live your most actualized self. When we talk about the social determinants of health, it's all of the different things in life that impact your health. And what was recognized over a decade ago, and nothing's changed, was that these issues are rooted in oppression and discrimination. The ability to access health insurance, employment, housing, adoption, retirement. It is still legal in many parts of the United States to deny someone a house if they're gay. The courts have backed the ability of adoption agencies to deny adoption services to gay parents. Lack of anti-bullying laws in schools. Lack of social programs, you know, within healthcare, because the health concerns of these communities were never taught in school. And it's still, out of a 4-year medical, a 4-year medical curriculum, less than 5 hours gets spent on LGBTQ health. And most of that is talking about gay men and HIV. And then the environment, the shortfall, safe schools. Access to recreational facilities and activities, being able to play sports. Most queer kids don't play competitive sports because of fear of being discriminated against. Then you tell the kids, well, first off, you can't play as who you are because of fears that are not grounded in evidence. And then the ability to access healthcare services. All of that negatively impacts the health of the community. So yeah, increased risk of suicide, increased risk of violence. Being transgender is not a psychopathology. I got it on another slide. It's not a mental illness. Homosexuality, being gay, and again, I'm using that as an umbrella term, was removed from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, in the 1970s. An older term, gender identity disorder, was removed in 2013. Yet 40% of transgender adults have attempted suicide. If you can't get a job, you get kicked out of your house. You have nowhere to live. You need to raise money to feed yourself. What's the one thing that you always got to sell? And that's your body. Increased risk of HIV and sexually transmitted infections. The disease burden for HIV within Black transgender women is magnitudes greater than the general population. Violence. The murder rate, the number of transgender individuals that have been murdered in the United States has been increasing over the last few years, and every year is the worst year on record. And the group most targeted are transgender women that are Black and brown. Increased risk for mental health concerns. Again, lack of support, stigmatized, your own members of the government are, villainizing you. Yeah, that might make you anxious and depressed. It might make you turn to self-medication. That was what, the government was talking about 10 years ago. Since then, other things, within the community, higher in probability of eating disorders or obesity. Again, self-medicating with food. Increased health risks because you don't get screened as much because of either fear of discrimination or because your providers don't realize, yes, I still need to do cervical cancer screens on anybody that has a cervix. I still need to do a PSA test on anybody that's got a prostate. And it doesn't matter whether that person's gender is male or female or non-binary. And lack of what we call SOGI data, sexual orientation or gender identity data. Until very recently, have we even bothered to want to collect this kind of demographic information, give people the opportunity to share it. And without that data, we don't know, what the true impact is. And in some ways, this is a very challenging environment. This is part of the environment that I live in professionally, is we know we need to get the data. But we also know that people in the community are fearful of sharing this information because if I tell you I'm trans, I am now giving you the opportunity to discriminate against me. And historically, that's exactly what's happened. So I don't trust you. There's this great lack of trust in the system. And then you look at the system challenges. When I talk about, system access, insurance, payer-payee mix. One of the challenges we have is Medicare is supposed to cover gender-affirming surgeries. But because of the way Medicare is administered in the United States, depending on what region you're in, you may or may not get it covered. When I talk about ownership and affiliation, in many states, most of the hospitals are affiliated with religious organizations, primarily the Catholic Church. You think and there are several Catholic affiliated hospitals that are getting sued because of the denial of gender affirming care. Again, training, education, developing both the cultural and clinical competence. Look at our facilities, now, without using a cliche of knowing that I'm preaching to the choir, is, you folks have probably looked at your forms. You've probably looked at your facilities to be gender neutral, to be inclusive. Most businesses have not. The forms, do they give you the option to tell people a chosen name, what your pronouns are? Do they have more gender options other than male and female? And then again, within healthcare, our electronic medical records, because none of these systems were designed with LGBTQ people in mind. None of them were designed with transgender folks in mind, specifically. So this is all stuff that has to now be retrofitted to be more inclusive. So why does this exist? And I already kind of, pulled the punch and said that it's rooted in discrimination and bigotry. And again, all of that, my next Yoda quote is about the dark side and fear. This pushback that you're seeing against the LGBTQ community broadly, transgender people specifically in society, is rooted in fear. People are afraid of the other. They've been intentionally misled and maintained in an ignorant status. And I'm ignorant in the sense of lack of knowledge. They're afraid. And yeah, fear leads to the dark side. It leads to anger. Listen to how people talk about transgender folks. You can hear the vitriol. That anger then leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. And you see it when the governor of Texas says that providing care, parents that are trying to take care of their kids are abusing them by giving them evidence-based, medically necessary care. Now you hear about all the bathroom bills. It was never about bathroom safety. That's a quote that's on that slide from a hate group out of Massachusetts that conceded it was all a sham because they didn't want to fight in the public about their animus towards LGBTQ people. So they made up this bad actor, story, never grounded in reality. And an intentional intellectual dishonesty. These are the titles of two different groups. The American Academy of Pediatrics is a real health professional. It's a professional organization. It's got several, over 10,000 members. This is the actual group of pediatricians. And notice that they're supportive of taking care of transgender kids. The American College of Pediatricians, again, and SPLC stands for the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's an anti-gay hate group that paints itself as a Christian health organization. It's about 600 members. It's based in Gainesville, Florida. They intentionally chose the name of their organization so that lay people would confuse them with the actual organization and give credence to what their positions are. Now notice the language that it talks about providing gender affirming care in terms of child abuse. Does that harken back to what I just said was the language used by the Republican governor in Texas? And this is, I'd be negligent if we were talking about this and I didn't hit this directly. What you're seeing in the public sphere when it comes to these attacks that are impacting the health of transgender kids. This is a conscious policy, and I'm not wearing a tinfoil hat. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do believe in intelligent battlefield reconnaissance and knowing who my enemy is. This is a conscious partisan tactic for partisan political power in a broken political system. Now, I know I'm talking to a Christian congregation. Some of you might be Republicans. I told you I was a Republican. This is a conscious attack. These are state resolutions in Kansas and Texas that simply refuses to validate that trans people exist or should exist in our society. Use of the term Christian by these hate groups, and when I say hate group, I mean identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate groups. Alliance Defending Freedom, you folks are up in Connecticut, right? The court case that challenged your state high school rules because of the track runners. The plaintiffs' attorneys were the Alliance Defending Freedom. That is, that's not a coincidence. These bills that have been entered in the states are all based on model bills that were created by these groups. And religious liberty is what's being used as a justification to deny civil equality to gay and transgender folks. Now, the two pictures that I have on this slide were from a protest at the University of Illinois, within the last several years. And note that the language that's being used to justify being anti-LGBTQ, invoking God, invoking scripture. So when we talk about trying to provide care to folks in the community, we hear that term gender affirming care. Well, what is that? It's holistic care. It is looking at all of the dimensions that impact health. And it's depathologizing. I said, being transgender is not an illness. Gender dysphoria is the term that's used in the DSM today to describe the distress when someone's anatomy doesn't align with their sense of who they are, and it doesn't align with how the world is interacting with you. The next version of the international codes for diagnostics takes the whole issue out of mental health and puts it in sexual health. Now, it still exists within the DSM because in the United States, if you want to get paid for providing healthcare, you need to have a diagnosis. And the diagnosis doesn't live anywhere but there. So it's a political and an insurance-driven issue. The other bottom line about gender affirming care is the patient's gender identity is what it is. The patient will tell you what it is, and okay, great, fine. It's not cis good, trans bad, or trans good, cis bad. It's okay, you are who you are. Now let's figure out what we need to do to help you be the healthiest you there is. And that means when we as healthcare professionals interact with people, we want to be trauma informed in the questions we ask and the physical exams that we do. And trauma informed means having the understanding that the patient, has probably experienced either psychological or physical or emotional trauma in their life. Now, most of us have been coming through a traumatic last 2 years because of the pandemic. So in some ways, it's a recognition that all human beings have been traumatized to some degree. Within the transgender and gender diverse community, that percentage is almost universal. I'm talking to you tonight as somebody who's privileged. Absolutely. I did not escape this. It is something that's negatively impacted my health. Transgender broken arm syndrome is something that happens within healthcare, where healthcare providers automatically ascribe the reason for any health problem to the fact that somebody's transgender or that they're taking hormones. And it's an inordinate look and concern about what the status of somebody's genitals are that has nothing to do with why they're seeking healthcare. Medically necessary gender affirming care is not experimental. It's not just grounded in a whim. It's based on decades of research. And it's grounded in standards of care from professional health bodies. The DSM is from the American Psychiatric Association, talked to you about gender dysphoria. WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, is an international body that sets the standards of care for transgender health globally. The standard of care version 7, that picture there is the current version. SOC 8 will be out later this year. I'm one of the people that's been involved in this process of revising these. The Endocrine Society, provides guidelines for how we use hormones. And then the Center of Excellence for Transgender Health at the University of California, San Francisco, have guidelines for clinicians that lay out what are the best practices for taking care of the community. So I've already hit the highlights of this slide. Is the bottom line is being transgender, not a mental disease, yet that is what people will use as an excuse. That's the part of the vitriol that you hear, part of the intentional misinformation that you hear. We talk about surgery. There is no the surgery. There are facial procedures, what we call top surgery, dealing with chest or breasts, and then bottom surgery to deal with genitals. What's medically necessary for one patient is not medically necessary for someone else. It goes, between the patient and the doc as to what's necessary to address their issues of gender incongruence and gender dysphoria. Now, another term that you may hear is gender euphoria, which is actually that euphoric feeling that people can experience when they're living as their authentic self. Now, let's talk about kids for a second, because this is obviously a hot button political item. This is medically necessary care that is grounded in evidence and best practices. You will hear people saying, right, you want to be intellectually honest. There's lots of stuff that we need more research about, because when you talk about doing longitudinal research that covers decades, seeing a kid at 4, seeing how they're doing at 34 is going to take time. Those studies are underway today. They obviously were not underway 25 years ago because nobody cared about doing this research. Today we do. But the way medicine actually works, we do a lot of things in medicine that we know has a beneficial outcome, and then the studies catch up. One of the examples I always use about, when they say, oh, there isn't these, randomly controlled double-blind studies. First off, how many randomly controlled double-blind studies do you think were done to test the efficacy of a parachute? And the answer is none. You're not going to randomly assign someone to the group that gets to jump out of the plane without a parachute to see what would happen. Also, when we talk about transgender healthcare, we know that gender affirming care is the most effective treatment and intervention for reducing anxiety, depression, suicidality, gender dysphoria. If you tried to do a randomly controlled double-blind study, you would have to have a group that you would deny that care to. And we know the increased risk of suicidality, harm, all those risks, those negative health impacts. It's unethical to do that kind of research. I always say the only place you'd ever get away with that kind of research would be at Dachau or Auschwitz. And I'm using those words with a lot of advisement. When we talk about kids, no one is given a 6-year-old hormones or doing surgery on a 6-year-old. When a child comes out at that early age, at school age, prepubescent, the intervention is social transition, social support. We can cut that kid's suicidality, and I told you that half of those kids are having suicidal ideation if they've got at least one supportive adult in their life. Just using the right pronoun, using the right name. When a kid gets towards puberty, that's when you may introduce something called a puberty blocker. It's a medication, will delay the onset of puberty that would otherwise happen. It buys the kid a little bit more time, but it also avoids trauma. Imagine you are a boy. How traumatic would it be for you to grow breasts or have your first period? You're a transgender girl. How traumatic is it to have your voice drop, to have your features on your face become more masculinized, have you grow body hair? Now, you can't delay puberty indefinitely, so you can block it for a while, but you just can't block it and not introduce another hormone, mostly testosterone or estrogen. And again, and this is within a binary approach to things. When you're talking about surgery, you're talking about an older adolescent. Right now, the current standard is 18. I expect that that's going to change by a year or two in the next version, but we'll see what happens when they produce the version. But these interventions go from reversible. You stop giving the hormone blocker, puberty is going to proceed, to the irreversible when we're talking about doing surgery. That's what care for transgender kids is. So, what can you do? And my immediate answer is to be a steadfast, loving, kind Christian. as we talk about the environment that we're all dealing with, the thing that I find personally most offensive and the thing that I, am saddest about, most angry about, is how we have let those who want to use religiosity, particularly their Christian religiosity here in the United States, as the justification for their bigotry, their ignorance, and in some cases, their outright hatred. So that when people hear that term, and I will use myself as this example, when someone comes up to me and the first thing they want to tell me about themselves is that they're a Christian, do you think that I'm thinking of Sermon on the Mount and that they'll know we're Christians by our love and we'll all sing Kumbaya? No. The first thing that I'm thinking about when you use that phrase to describe yourself, you're a narrow-minded, willfully ignorant bigot until you prove me wrong. And I hate that. So yeah, that's one of the things that we can do. We can stand up and take that back. Who believe that that message of love applies to everybody. We've seeded that understanding. So it's being an ally. These are a couple of pamphlets, from organizations, and I'll send you the slide deck. And in the slide deck, I've got some resources and I've got the references that that I mentioned here. That if you're not part of the community, some of the things that you can do to support kids, to support your friends and your family members. Using people's name and pronouns. Language is the most simplest thing you can do to demonstrate support and affirmation. Ask the appropriate questions in an appropriate manner. It is never an appropriate question at a cocktail party to be asking somebody, hey, have you had the surgery? Or, hey, have you got a penis or a vagina? And people think that they can ask those kinds of questions of transgender people. Oh, I'm just curious. I had a radio talk show host ask me that. I called into the morning radio talk show in Baltimore because the two of them were talking about transgender athletes. And I called in and I didn't identify myself beyond saying, I graduated from the Naval Academy and I've got an opinion on this. I didn't identify myself as affiliated with Hopkins. I didn't identify myself as someone who works in transgender healthcare. And on the air, we were talking about it. Soon as we went into break, one of the hosts wanted to ask me whether or not I could have an orgasm. And my response was, that's a lousy pickup line. And then I said, I think the question you're trying to ask me is whether or not a transgender woman who has a vaginoplasty can function sexually. And the answer is yes. So I answered the question that, given them the benefit of the doubt, but it's that prurient question. Think that it's okay. You wouldn't think of asking anybody else that kind of a question. And then let people use their own language to describe themselves. So when we talk about the names and the pronouns, most transgender people do not have government issued ID that matches who they are. Because you have to go through a bunch of legal hoops that cost money. And the legal system hasn't exactly been overly friendly to transgender people. And when they have that mismatched ID, they get discriminated against. So when you meet somebody, I'm going to give you a different way of introducing yourself for you to consider. And I'm not going to sit here and say that this is easy. This is something really, really new. This is not how we've been doing this. So it's going to take some practice. Hi, I'm Paula. My pronouns are she and her. How would you like me to address you and what pronouns do you use? That introduction immediately gets through all those assumptions because I'm going to ask you to tell me how you want me to talk to you. I'm not going to assume out of reflex to use sir or ma'am. Now, come from the Navy. I know all about reflexively saying sir or ma'am without thinking about it. But again, we've been taught to use sir or ma'am or Mr. or Ms. reflexively as a sign of respect. How can I help you, sir? Did that sound respectful and helpful? No, but I use the word. It's the tone of your voice. It's your body. It's your nonverbal communication. It's your authenticity that demonstrate the respect and helpfulness. Hey, how can I help you? Notice I didn't use the word sir or ma'am, but it sounds a lot better. You going first also lets the other person know that you're savvy enough to know that this is important. And you're offering the opportunity for them to share with you. Now, if you have to look up files, depending on what your job is and what the situation is that, you say, hey, could your file be under another name if you can't find it under the name that they told you?
Paula, we're running a little bit short on time. So I just was wondering if we could have some time for question and answer when you're done with the slide or in the next few minutes.
Yep, absolutely. And actually, I think there's like 2 more slides. Don't ask people what their real name is. This is a slide that shows you how to use gendered and gender neutral pronouns. And the term like Mr. or Ms. for somebody who's non-binary is mix. And it's pronounced like the word mix. There's the resources I was talking to you about. And now we're up for Q&A.
Thank you, Paula.
Would you like to unshare your screen now, Paula, so we can
Yes.
see each other?
Absolutely.
And then if people can stick around, if you need to log off, I understand because we are like over time. But if you have questions, please stick around. And again, there's no stupid question. So let's hear what you might be thinking or asking or anything that maybe Paula said that you want to respond to.
I'd like to say thank you, Paula. I know this was extremely one-on-one. Made this easy, digestible. My heart is just breaking that people have to explain themselves, identify themselves, the discrimination. I cried through a lot of this.
Thanks for sharing that, Amy. Is that this is tough stuff, and for people who care and really want to see us get to be better, it's tough.
Jane, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I had 2 questions and they're kind of different. One of them is around the gender pronouns and making sure that we respectively address each other in the way that we want to be addressed, and how that is going to work in states like Texas and Florida and places that are passing these laws that make it extremely difficult for example, teachers to behave this way. How would I, as a teacher in a classroom in one of these places, be that kind of person when I'm being told I kind of can't be? Isn't that what's going on with these laws?
Yes, without being overly glib, yes, that is exactly what they're trying to do with these laws. And the reality of the situation is that they've passed the law, they're getting sued in court, and then it will have to play out through the legal process. The individual then has to make that individual decision: is, am I going to do what's right because I know it's the right thing to do, even if it's against the law? And basically you talk about civil disobedience, is that is, you can pass the law. I am not going to abide by it, knowing the consequence may be that I get fired, maybe, whatever the legal ramification could potentially be. I'm not going to sit here and say to anybody that that is easy. That's a tough decision to make, but that's the decision people are finding themselves in with these laws.
So my other question is different, and you touched on it sounded to me like the Christian being a code word for being a bigot, and how terribly sad that is. Mm-hmm. And you suggested we try to take that word back, and I wonder how, what is the pathway for taking that back?
Being visible, again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, because I know I'm not saying something that's radical for this group. It's being your authentic selves. The fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that on your website you have a very good statement of inclusivity, and you live that Christian faith of diversity and inclusion. That's how you stand up to that. And when, again, within your sphere of influence, when, within, the ecumenical bodies and interdenominational bodies that people operate in, when folks that are going to use their dogma to justify this stuff, you stand up and you say, no, that is not what Christ would be doing. That is not my view. Now, I ain't naive. That is absolutely confrontational. But you can't cede it, because being quiet, not showing the other side of, no, I'm a Christian and my faith calls me to be inclusive and embracing and affirming, so that you don't allow that only interpretation of what it means to be a Christian for the masses to see that the only people using that word have this horrible message that runs counter to what I would argue is our common understanding of what the teachings are.
So maybe one thing we can do as a congregation is every time we have a Zoom meeting, everybody put their pronouns in, so that we automatically show each other what our pronouns are as a matter of practice. I think that's one thing maybe we can do.
I know in Faith Lab, for our younger folks, the kids all put their pronouns on their name tags when they get their name tags when they check in. So that, and Jordan and I were just texting back and forth earlier about things that we're thinking about. So if you have other ideas of how we can be more inclusive as a church, or things that you see or hear that we can fix, please let us know. Thank you, Jane. Any other questions?
I think Sandy's trying to talk.
Oh, Sandy, you're muted. There you go.
I just unmuted myself. I just wanted to say how much I appreciated this forum. I learned a lot, and it was just extremely interesting. And I actually have one friend who is in the process of transitioning, but the way I found out is I said I didn't know anyone like that. Well, you do now. So it was very, very informative, and thank you for being willing to do it.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Sandy, and I see Judith has a question too. Judith, you're muted, so let me ask to unmute you. There you go. Perfect.
That work? Oh, hang on a second. Okay.
You're great. We can hear you.
You're good.
Oh, okay, good. Hi, I'm Judith, and the pronouns are she and her. I could see where there would be a lot. Well, I learned a few things I knew, a few things I didn't know. Well, quite a bit I didn't know. I would say, like, as far as like healthcare being paid for, some of it, like with insurance, there
Mhm.
is going to have to be a lot of legal changes made because I think some of the stuff that you're mentioning is like probably like with facial things is considered plastic surgery.
Mhm.
And there's, insurance does not want to pay for plastic surgery.
Mhm.
Mm,
No, you're absolutely right. Is that's one of the ongoing processes. I know in Maryland, the bill stalled in our state legislature, expanding our Medicaid coverage to include facial gender surgery. I know at Hopkins, both on the university side and our health system side, as of July 1st, we're going to be expanding our coverage. But you're absolutely right, is that's a continuing process of dealing with insurance, trying to better explain and give people a better understanding of, that no, this is not cosmetic. This really is medically necessary for addressing an issue. As the whole health
Mhm.
system is, insurance is
Yeah.
broken, the health system is broken, trying to do
Yeah.
all of this for every, but you're absolutely correct.
Well, I want to thank you so much. And I do have Paula's information. So if people have more questions, I know how to find her. But thank you so, so much. Again, just what Sandy said, and just your willingness to be yourself, to be authentic and vulnerable and open with us has been such a gift. So any other closing questions or reflections from anyone in the group? So thank you again so much, Paula, and I'm grateful for your time tonight on behalf of the whole church. And I'm really so thankful you were here. And thank you to each of you for coming and for persevering through an hour and 45 minutes of
Yeah.
very educational and important
Great.
information. So thank you all so much.
See what happens when you ask a lawyer to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you
It's
so much.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Take
folks.
care. Thanks again, Paula.
Thank you.